Alright, starting off at number 10 now, we have the twin studies. Joseph Mengele was the chief medical officer at Auschwitz concentration camp during the Holocaust. Far from being a doctor to the people there, he used them as part of his sort of twisted medical studies. Mengele had an obsession with twins. From 1943 to 1944, he performed experiments on almost 1,500 sets of in-prison twins. Just 200 of them survived. One study involved injecting different dyes into the eyes of twins to see whether it would change their eye color. Another involved sewing twins together in some sort of sick attempt to create conjoined twins. Some of the other studies are far too graphic to even talk about in this video. Next up at number 9 now, we have the poison labs. This is the name given to the Soviet Union's secret testing labs for poisons. During the 1950s, the researchers there would test deadly poisons on prisoners who came from the gulags. That translates to enemies of the people. These poisons included mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, curare, cyanide, and many others. All of them are deadly to humans and many of them are very painful. The goal of these studies was to find a tasteless, odorless chemical that could not be detected after death. In a final sick twist to this story, the prisoners were told that the poison was actually medicine for them. Insane. Next up at number 8 now, we have the Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo led a research team to study human behavior when it came to authority and inmates in a prison setting. He set up a mock prison and got 24 volunteers to take part in it. They were assigned as either prisoners or the guards watching over them. Everything was designed to look and feel like a real prison, from the uniforms to the cells and even the ID numbers. The guards started to get way more involved in their roles than the researchers thought they would, verbally and then physically abusing their prisoners. By just the second day, the prisoners had already started to rebel. The guards put it down with brutal violence against them. The prisoners began to get emotionally traumatized, and on the 6th day, the experiment was ended 8 days early. Moving on to number 7 now, we have the Aversion Project. This experiment was a medical torture program in South Africa conducted by Dr. Aubrey Levin during the 1970s and 1980s. It was the military's attempt to root out homosexuality from the army, as it was seen back then as a mental illness. Over the years, 900 gay servicemen and some women were sent to the infamous Ward 22 for sexual reassignment surgeries, some of them as young as 16 years old. These surgeries involved chemical castration and electric shock treatment. The surgery attempted to change the men into physical females. Apart from these surgeries being horrifically unethical, they were also botched quite often, leaving the victims cast out into the world without the hormones needed to maintain their new identities. Coming at number 6 now, we have Project 4.1. This was a US medical study of people living on the Marshall Islands who were exposed to radiation from a nearby nuclear bomb test in 1954. The study effectively saw them as guinea pigs in a radiation experiment. Many people accused the US government of having their primary goal as studying the people and not actually helping them. The poor residents of the Marshall Islands suffered miscarriages, stillbirths, developmental difficulties, and impaired growth. The government knew the American public would not react kindly to news of this experiment and ordered everyone involved to keep it a secret. But as you can tell, secrets always get out. Next up at number 5 now, we have the Monster Study. With a name like that, you know it's not going to be good. This study took place at the University of Iowa in 1939 by Wendell Johnson. They took 22 orphan children and split them into 2 separate groups. One group was given positive speech therapy. That means they were praised and encouraged as they became more fluent in English. The other half got the exact opposite. They were belittled, even bullied every single time they made a mistake. This had a serious negative effect on the children. Some of them even stopped speaking altogether. Their mental health and academic studies suffered greatly. The university tried to sweep all of this under the rug, but eventually the details came out. They were criticized heavily for damaging vulnerable orphan children, maybe permanently, just to prove a theory. The university issued a public apology in 2001. At the number 4 spot now, we have the Willowbrook State School. This was a school in New York for people with mental disabilities. Starting from the late 1950s, medical researchers noticed there were large hepatitis outbreaks there. They studied it to gain a better understanding of the illness. However, the researchers seemed to cross a line when they began feeding live hepatitis viruses to 60 healthy children in order to study them. They watched their skin and eyes turn yellow, their livers got bigger, and they began to vomit and even refuse to eat. The researchers justified all of this by saying, well, they were going to get hepatitis anyway, but history has definitely condemned them. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Tuskgee Experiment. This clinical study by the US Public Health Service took place for an astounding 40 20 years, beginning in 1932. It involved offering 399 poor black males who had syphilis a treatment. However, the researchers withheld the treatment as their real aim was to just study the progress of syphilis on humans. In 1947, penicillin became available as a treatment. Some of the victims began to look elsewhere for help, but the researchers told them not to and continued to lie about their true condition. When the study finally ended in 1972, just 74 of the 399 test subjects were still alive. 28 of them had died of syphilis, 100 from other complications. 40 of their wives had also been infected, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. As part of a class action lawsuit, the US government paid $9 million to the surviving participants and their descendants. For many people though, the pain can never be healed with money. Next up at number 2 now, we have mustard gas. In 1943, the US Navy exposed its own sailors to mustard gas in order to test the effectiveness of their new protective clothing for it. They wanted to see how it stood up in a real life situation and not just in a lab. Perhaps the most infamous of these experiments involved 17 and 18-year-old males still in boot camp who were asked if they wanted to take part in an experiment that would shorten the war. Of course, many of them said yes, but it wasn't until they reached a lab that they were told it would involve mustard gas. Some of them left at this point, but many of them didn't. Most of the participants suffered extreme external and internal burns. They were largely ignored by the Navy after that because they didn't want to draw attention to this awful experiment. And finally, at number 1 now, we have Unit 731. This was the secret chemical warfare research unit of Japan during World War II. They wanted to study the human body in perverse ways and mainly did so on Allied prisoners of war as well as Chinese civilians. Experiments included limb amputation to study the effects of blood loss, and sometimes they would even try and reattach amputated limbs to the other side of the body just to see what would happen. One other famous experiment there involved freezing all of the subject's limbs and then amputating them one by one until only the victim's head and torso remained. This is only really scratching the surface into the horrors that Unit 731 brought upon its many victims. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Manhattan Project. Some of you guys may recognize the name of this one. It was the secret name for America's project to produce the atomic bombs that brought World War II to an end. Harry Daghlian was a young physicist who worked on the project. During an experiment on August 21st, 1945, he was attempting to build a neutron reflector manually by stacking a set of 4.4 kilogram tungsten carbide bricks in an incremental fashion around a plutonium core. Unfortunately, he dropped a brick which set off a chain reaction. He tried to stop the reaction, but by the time it was over, he received a high dose of neutron radiation. Harry received intense medical care for severe radiation poisoning. His mother and sister even flew out to New Mexico to care for him, but Harry fell into a coma. He died 25 days after the accident. His death resulted in new safety regulations when handling radioactive material. Next up at number 9 now, we have the Dioxin Tests. In 1965, dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman conducted a study on behalf of the US Army and some pharmaceutical companies. They wanted to know how human skin reacts to harsh chemicals, a process known as hardening. Most of the information about these tests has since been destroyed or just covered up. We do know that he described his patients as acres of skin to experiment on. We also know he used dioxin on them, the active ingredient in Agent Orange. This happened around the time the US was covering Vietnam with Agent Orange in an attempt to push the fight against the Viet Cong in their favor. To speed up the experiments, Dr. Kligman injected his victims with a reported 468 times the recommended safe dose of dioxin. After that, not much more has been uncovered. It's thought there are still about 70 of the patients out there still. Their identities and current condition unknown. Next up at number 8 now, we have Operation Sea Spray. In September 1950, the US Navy spent 6 days spreading the bacterium Serratia marcescens into the air about 2 miles off the coast of California. That bacterium lives in soil and water and is best known for its ability to produce a bright red pigment. This trait makes it useful in experiments because it's so bright, it's very easy to see where it is. The project was called Operation Sea Spray. Its aim was to determine the susceptibility of a big city like San Francisco to a bioweapon attack by terrorists. In the following days, the military took samples of 43 sites to track the bacteria's spread. They found that it had infested the whole city and all the surrounding suburbs as well. During the test, residents of San Francisco inhaled millions of bacterial spores. The military deemed the experiment a success. They got to see how far chemical warfare could spread, and anyway, they knew the bacterium wasn't harmful, or so they thought. People started getting urinary tract infections, and it was even linked to the death of a patient recovering from prostate surgery. This experiment wasn't even public knowledge until 1976, a full 26 years after the the event. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Project MKULTRA. This is a particularly famous one you guys may have heard me talk about in a previous video. During the 1950s and 60s, at the height of the Cold War, the US feared that communist countries were using mind control techniques to brainwash US prisoners of war in Korea. They wanted in on the action. So in response, the CIA authorized Project MKULTRA in 1953. The secret operation was aimed at developing a defense against drugs or other manipulators that could control human behavior. Such was the secrecy of this project that even today, not much is known about it. But we do know this: the project involved more than 150 human experiments involving psychedelic drugs, paralytics, and electroshock therapy. Sometimes the test subjects were aware they were participating in a study, but shockingly, many did not, even when the hallucinogenic effects started kicking in. Can you even imagine how scary that would be? Many of the tests took place at universities, hospitals, or prisons in the US and Canada between 1953 and 1964. The CIA didn't keep many records though, and any good ones were destroyed when the program came to an official end in 1973. Moving on to number 6 now, we have North Korea. Some of the things we've all heard about North Korea may not be true, but some of them may be even worse than we could ever imagine. In 2014, a former North Korean officer stepped forward to say that the nation's military were using mentally and physically disabled children as test subjects in chemical experiments. He said this was the last straw that caused him to defect and leave the country. The man was called Im Cheon-young, and he said he was taken to special training at the military academy. It was there where they taught him how to confuse the enemy without revealing your own forces, how to carry out assassinations, and how to use chemical weapons. He was close to defecting on this alone, and then came the field learning. This involved testing biological and chemical weapons on so-called objects. At first, these objects were mice, but soon they were using humans. Im said that he saw with his very own eyes disabled people, sometimes children, being killed by these chemical weapons just to show the soldiers how they worked. One expert said this is not surprising. Anyone who visits the capital will never see disabled people because they are allegedly taken away as children and incarcerated in special camps. Perhaps these evil experiments are what the camps are all leading up to. Moving on to number 5 now, we have Project QKHILLTOP. This was a CIA project developed to study Chinese brainwashing techniques, which they used to develop new methods of interrogation. The research was led by a man named Dr. Howard Wolf. Now, he was a researcher at Cornell University's medical school. Dr. Wolf requested the CIA provide him with information on imprisonment, deprivation, humiliation, torture, brainwashing, hypnosis, and more. Based on this, the team began to formulate a plan. They wanted to develop secret drugs and various brain-damaging procedures. According to a letter that he wrote, in order to fully test the effects of this, Wolf wanted the CIA to make available suitable subjects. Once they had provided these poor souls to test on, Wolf also detailed the next step his research team would take. They would then assemble, collate, analyze, and assimilate the information, and will then undertake experimental investigations designed to develop new techniques of offensive, defensive intelligence using a potentially useful secret drug. Basically, the whole thing is just the stuff of nightmares. I have no idea how this got through. Nothing more is really known about the test subjects, or victims as they are often referred to now. Moving up to number 4 now, we have Dr. Lauretta Bender. This doctor has gone down in history for her experiments on children. She was a child psychiatrist who specialized in children believed to have schizophrenia. For almost 3 decades, from 1942 to 1969, she was a highly respected expert in her field. Her preferred choice of treatment was electroshock therapy. These days, the practice has been banned in most of the world as it's seen as ineffective, cruel, and borderline torture in some cases. Still, this was a different time, and that's what Dr. Bender did to the children. Her methods involved interviewing and analyzing a sensitive child in front of a large group of people. She would then apply a gentle amount of pressure to the child's head. The theory was any child who moved with the pressure was showing early signs of schizophrenia. These days, that's referred to as total pseudoscience, but it took a while to figure that out. By the time her treatments were shut down, Bender had used electroshock therapy on over 100 children, the youngest of whom was just age 3. Reports described her as uncaring and the study as unethical. The shocks can cause memory loss, nausea, headaches, jaw pain, or even serious heart trouble, even in kids. Some say all of this was a result of Bender's misunderstood childhood that she had, and she was the product of her own environment and family. Now that is proper psychology. I'm just saying. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Burke and Hale murders. William Burke is a guy who has probably tainted my surname forever. Along with William Hale, these two men from Northern Ireland were famous grave robbers in Scotland. One day, an old man they knew died, and to cover his outstanding debt to them, they decided to sell his body for medical science. Edinburgh University gave them £7 and 10 shillings, a handsome sum in those days. With that, they were hooked. When another associate they knew fell ill, they couldn't even wait to see if he would die, and so they suffocated him in his bed. Again, they sold his body to the university for money. The killing spree began. The pair murdered and sold bodies almost as their full-time jobs. They killed an old grandmother with an overdose of painkillers. Hare even killed his own blind grandson by breaking his back across his knee. Eventually though, their whole operation was discovered when they got too sloppy. William Burke was hanged in front of a cheering crowd of over 25,000 people. Fittingly, after being put on public display, his body was donated to medical science. Next up at number 2 now, we have J. Marion Sims. This doctor was once praised as the father of modern gynecology. Now his reputation has been tarnished forever. It was found that he practiced these surgical techniques that made him famous on enslaved women. They included Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. The rest of them are unknown. He performed 30 surgeries on Anarcha alone, all without anesthesia. His legacy has long been questioned for the disturbing ethical questions that it raises, especially by those who believe that he used black women as medical guinea pigs without their consent. The Black Youth Project 100, a group of activists aged between 18 and 35, staged protests at a statue of Sims in New York. They wore hospital gowns splashed with red paint dripping down their legs. In a Facebook post, they explained that Sims had purchased black women slaves and used them as guinea pigs for his untested surgical experiments. He repeatedly performed genital surgery on black women without anesthesia because, according to him, black women don't feel pain. Despite his very inhumane tests on black women, Sims was named the father of modern gynecology, and his statue currently stands right outside the New York Academy of Medicine. And finally, number 1 now, we have the pregnant women. In January 2018, it emerged that after the Second World War, the US military gave nearly 1,000 pregnant women radioactive iron by their doctors without their knowledge. This was all part of a series of experiments to test the effects. Between 1945 and 1947, researchers at Vanderbilt University conducted this sick experiment that was funded by the US Public Health Service. All of the women were poor and had no knowledge of the experiment whatsoever. Afterwards, they were not even informed that they had been part of the study either. The radioactive iron was given as part of a medical cocktail by health officials that they trusted. Their aim was to record the absorption of iron during pregnancy. However, in the years since then, investigators have said this too was a lie, and that the real reason was for the military to learn more about radiation exposure. In the 1990s, Vanderbilt University finally acknowledged and investigated the experiments. The story broke when 2 women and one of their daughters filed a lawsuit against the university for exposing them to radiation. One of the women was Emma Kraft. She said at a Senate hearing that the experiments caused the death of her 11-year-old daughter due to cancer. The true effects of the study are still being investigated today. Starting us off at number 10 now, we have the resurrection. We're starting off with a really weird one here from 1780. Luigi Galvani was a scientist who discovered that he could make the muscles of a dead frog twitch and jerk with a spark of electricity. He was fascinated by this, and his curiosity took him into a very morbid place. He obtained the head of an ox and used electricity to make its tongue move. Soon, other scientists obtained the bodies of recently executed criminals to carry out their experiments. Andrew Ure would make incisions in corpses' necks, hips and heels, exposing different nerves to jolts from metallic rods. He was amazed to see that one particular jolt made the diaphragm go up and down as if the dead body was actually breathing. He even used the jolts on their faces, causing expressions of fear, rage, horror, despair, anguish, and ghastly smiles. If this sounds like Frankenstein to you, well, you're not exactly wrong. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, was well aware of these experiments. Some might say that Frankenstein is sort of an exaggerated version of these experiments. Others say they are equally disturbing. Moving on to number 9 now, we have artificial blood. This one honestly made me squirm. In 2004, a story broke in Chicago about artificial blood being tested on people without their consent. You heard me right. Artificial blood, no consent. Paramedics were testing this experimental blood substitute on severely injured patients without their consent. Supporters of the product, known as polyheme, say it's safer and could save the lives of many of the nearly 100,000 people who die of bleeding injuries every year in the US. They argue that they can't ask for the patient's consent because quite often they are unconscious or in shock. As a result, they were allowed to bypass the consent rules because their work comes under emergency life-saving research. Some patients' rights advocates disagreed though, saying it was a slippery slope to demolishing individual rights to experimental consent. They also point out that a higher than average number of people had died during similar studies with this thing. How would you guys feel if they tested this artificial blood on you without you ever knowing? Next up at number 8 now we have the newborns. This is a shocking experiment that took place at the University of California in the 1960s. Researchers there wanted to study how blood pressure and blood flow worked on babies. They used 113 newborns in their studies, ranging from 3 days old down to just 1 hour. 1 hour old. In one experiment, a catheter was inserted through the umbilical artery of the babies and into the aorta. Then the newborns' feet were immersed in ice water so they could test the aortic pressure. Sounds pretty shocking, right? Imagine if this was your first experience on Earth. Well, amazingly, it gets worse. In another of the study's experiments, up to 50 newborns were strapped onto a circumcision board. They then tilted the board almost upside down so that the baby's blood rushed to their heads. Then they measured the blood pressure. Just the whole thing sounds horrible. Next up at number 7 now we have the plague. This is the story of Richard Strong. He was a tropical medicine professor at Harvard who worked on a number of serious diseases. In 1906, while working as the head of Philippine Biological Laboratory, he tested a potential cholera vaccine on 24 men. Little did he know though that the vaccines had been accidentally contaminated with bubonic plague. If that disease sounds familiar to you, you may recognize it by another name, the Black Death. This is the plague that was responsible for wiping out somewhere between 75 to 200 million people across Europe and Asia. Somehow, Mr. Strong had injected this devastating disease straight into his 24 patients, 13 of them died. Moving on to number 6 now, we have digestion. On June 6, 1822, a Canadian man called Alexis St. Martin was accidentally shot in Michigan at a fur trading post. The bullet left a hole through his side which eventually healed into a fistula, a hole into his stomach through the abdominal wall. An American army doctor called William Beaumont was treating him and had an idea. At the time, not much was known in science about human digestion, and Beaumont saw an opportunity. He could literally watch the process of digestion by dangling food on a string into the man's stomach, then later pulling it out to observe to what extent it had been digested. A string. He dangled the food into the guy's stomach on a string. What? He continued these experiments for the best part of 10 years. The results did teach the world a lot about how digestion works, and Alexis himself lived to 83 years old. A win-win for everyone, but still a pretty gory story. Next up at number 5 now we have the cancer patients. This was a horrible experiment that took place at the University of Cincinnati from 1960 to 1971. Dr. Eugene Sanger was a radiologist at the university who was being funded by the US military to test the effects of radiation in the event of a nuclear attack. He exposed 88 poor black patients with cancer to whole body radiation. He told them that this was a treatment for their cancer. It was not that. The patients were not asked to sign consent forms, nor were they told the Pentagon was funding the experiment. In periods of up to 1 hour, they were exposed to about 20,000 x-rays worth of radiation. The results included nausea, vomiting, severe stomach pains, loss of appetite, and mental confusion. A report in 1972 found that up to a quarter of patients died from radiation poisoning. This is honestly one of the most disturbing experiments I've ever heard of. Prime example of institutionalized racism and complete disregard for the sanctity of human life. Sorry to get quite heavy there, but yeah, this one was really shocking. Moving on to number 4 now, we have the Milgram Experiment. This is one of the most famous psychology experiments ever conducted, but perhaps not for the best reasons. It was a study of obedience in psychology carried out by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University. He was interested in World War II and the justifications many Nazis gave for the atrocities they did. The reason often came down to obedience. So, in 1961, Milgram set up tests to see how far Americans would go if they were told to commit crimes by an authority figure. Each participant was paired up with another person. One was told they were the learner, the other was the teacher. What the participant didn't know was that they were always the teacher. The whole thing was fixed. The learner was actually in on the experiment. The teacher was taken into a separate room and told to ask the learner a series of questions over the phone. If they answered wrong, the teacher was told to press a button and administer an electric shock to the learner. Of course, the shocks weren't real, but the teacher didn't didn't know that. All they heard was the ever-increasing screams from the learner each time they supposedly shocked them. Some participants voiced their concerns and were calmly told by the man in the lab coat that the experiment must go on. Despite never being told they couldn't leave, 65% of participants continued up to the highest level of 450 volts, by which point the screams had worryingly stopped altogether. It was a shocking insight into how obedience can drive humans to do terrible things, no matter where they're from in the world. Next up at number 3 now, we have boiling water. Before the Civil War, medical treatments were crude at best. During the 1840s, Dr. Walter Jones thought he had found a cure for typhoid fever, pouring 5 gallons of boiling hot water onto bare skin. No prizes for knowing how that turned out. He carried out his treatment on slaves, which included a young man who was forced to lie down and endure the boiling water being poured on his bare skin repeatedly for hours and hours. As far as modern science is concerned, this is not a valid cure for typhoid fever, rather it was plain old torture. Tragically, Dr. Walter and his accomplices got away with it, mostly because the research was conducted on slaves. Moving on to number 2 now, we have David Reimer. This is the tragic tale of a Canadian man who was born as a twin in 1965. At 8 months old, he and his brother had minor medical problems involving their penises. The doctor botched the surgery though on David, burning virtually all of his penis off. At the advice of a psychologist, David's parents agreed to have him sex reassigned and made into a female through a combination of surgical, hormonal and psychological treatment. The treatment was plagued with cases of child abuse by his doctor, Dr. John Money. David was raised as a girl called Brenda up until the age of 14, whereupon his parents finally decided to tell him the truth. Over the next 7 years, David changed his name back to David and underwent treatment to try and reverse the reassignment. He had a troubled life afterwards though, mired in personal tragedy, including the suicide of his own twin brother. When his wife left him in 2004, he took his own life at the age of 38. And finally, number 1 now, we have psychic driving. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron was a scientist behind one of the most disturbing brainwashing experiments ever. The CIA funded his research. They wanted to find ways to wipe a person's memory clean and even implant new memories that they thought were their own. The patients thought they were being treated for personal trauma. They had no idea of the true damage being done to them. Cameron would play endless tapes to his patients for hours at a time while bringing them in and out of an insulin-induced coma. Sometimes this would go on for 85 days. The treatment was known as psychic driving. In modern times, many of the families affected by these experiments have been paid large sums of money for what they went through, but no government or agency has ever stepped forward to admit their wrongdoing.